Hello everyone, this is the second part of lecture number 18, the early Roman Empire from 14 to 138 AD, and this is for History 231, Ancient Mediterranean World. And we left off last time with the year 69 AD, and it was a very bad year for the Romans, the year 69. There's lots of chaos and trouble in the empire because they didn't have a system worked out for succession of the emperor. And so Emperor Nero, kind of a nut, they had killed him. They'd had to get rid of him because he was out of control and they didn't have any system of impeachment, so they got rid of the emperor, killed our friend Nero, he's out of the picture, but now how do you come up with a replacement? They didn't have a system for doing that. As a result of this, the year 69 is basically a short, painful civil war within the empire as various and sundry strongmen use their armies to try and take control and make themselves the next emperor. A classic problem if you don't have a system of succession worked out. So, what now? Well, at the end of this, a fellow named Vespasian, Vespasian, he manages to seize power and he becomes the next emperor. And he's the first of what we call the Flavian emperors. And he rules from 69 to 79 AD. All right, and his two sons, one is named Titus and the other is named Domitian, come after him. Now they're interesting because they come outside the tradition, come from outside, I should say, the traditional ruling families of Rome here. And they come to power because they're smart, because they're capable men. All right, they come to power because they are capable men. At least two of them are, as we'll see. Vespasian understands stability is all important. You've got to have a stable empire, and that means you've got to have good government in the provinces. It's not enough to simply control Rome. You've got to have good government in the provinces. And that means he spends a lot of time playing political games to make sure he has good relationships with the Senate, which is still around, remember, with the Senate and also with various constituencies. He wants to make sure everyone is comfortable and reasonably happy because he knows that leads to stability. Stability means things are going to be better for him and for the empire as a whole here, all right? And of course, this is a tough time for the Romans. In 70 AD, remember, the Jews, we're going to talk about this, the Jews had rebelled against the Romans at exactly this time, and that rebellion had to be crushed as well here. There were also other rebellions, one along the Rhine River, for example, and so forth, okay? Also, various troubles in Britain, where the legions are beginning to move north. All right, so, this means, of course, the Romans are now having to face a certain kind of a situation. This is something interesting about the Roman Empire versus the Republic. The thing about the empire is this. It is not an expansionist state. The Republic, the Roman Republic, expanded like crazy. That was, in fact, one of its problems. It got them into all kind of trouble. Too much expansion too fast. The empire stabilizes. Built around the Mediterranean Sea, it stabilizes, and this allows it to be stable over the long period, over the long haul. All right, and so this is going to be tricky. Now Titus comes to power. All right, he comes to power, and he's a pretty smart guy. He's known for being a nice guy. He gives out nice, good stuff, and he's also faced with problems. All right. Now, this is something to keep in mind. If you become president or emperor or whatever, you don't know the day you arrive in the job what kind of problems await you. You only know they're going to be there. All right, they're going to be there. Well, our friend Titus had a number of problems. There was a disastrous fire in Rome. Keep in mind that cities in these days did not have really good fire departments, and when a fire broke out, it could burn half the city down. It was a disastrous fire, in this case in Rome. There was also the outbreak of plague, and this is something, of course, in our current time. The reason I'm giving this lecture from my home is because of this silly, terrible, horrible, awful coronavirus that we all hope will get figured out and off our plate soon, but it may be a while. But this coronavirus, of course, is a plague. All right, is a type of a plague causing us lots and lots of problems. Well, guess what? They had a plague in Italy, and this means, of course, lots of suffering and lots of death. And keep in mind, they didn't have modern medicine. There's no antibiotics. There's none of these modern medical things that we have today. So a plague was a serious problem. He has this. And then two cities, one named Pompeii, the other named Vesuvius, were destroyed when the volcano, Mount Vesuvius, sitting right next to them, blew up. Just poof. Now, Vesuvius is one of these boom volcanoes. We see there's two kinds of volcanoes in the world. They're the ones like that you find in Hawaii, which go gurgle, 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 burp. And then there's the kind that go boom. Krakatoa is the most famous recent example of these. Mount St. Helens is another one. These are the boom volcanoes, and when they go off, they can cause a huge amount of damage very quickly. And guess what? Mount Vesuvius blows up, and 2 entire Roman cities are buried under the ash, which is great for us. I've been to Pompeii. It's great for us. This entire Roman city is preserved under the ash, and the archaeologists have been able to excavate it, and this has led them to all sorts of really interesting discoveries. However, suffice it to say, and we have bodies of people who died there, it was a really sucky thing for the Romans, all right? And that is something to keep in mind as well. So that is our friend Titus. And then there's Domitian, the next guy. And Domitian, well, he's not such a good emperor. He has problems here. He has a problem supporting one group over another. He supports the equestrians at the expense of the senators. He's got internal dissension. And whenever political leaders play people off against each other like this, it causes resentment and it causes lots and lots of problems here. And why does he do this? Because he thinks he's large and in charge and do what he wants here. He's got himself an arrogant ego issue. And yes, here's the thing. He actually expected people to call him Lord God. Now remember what I've said. Whenever somebody, and it's not April 1st, claims to be a god, it's time to call the psychiatric department because they've lost their marbles here, all right? And so finally, Domitian, it gets out of control. And how do you get rid of them? Well, the Romans have kind of figured out a way to get rid of bad emperors. It ain't pretty, but it works, and that means they kill him. And in September of 96 AD, Domitian is done in. He's assassinated in his palace, and now he's out of the picture, so he's gone. But of course, they're learning. Okay, the Romans are not stupid, they're learning, and they realize that if you kill the bad emperor, fine, because he's a bad emperor, you got to get rid of the guy, but have a backup plan. Pick his successor before you kill him. The conspirators who killed Domitian had picked a guy before they killed him to be the next emperor, and that is a guy named Nerva. Now, Nerva is a solid guy. All right, he's a solid sort of guy. He comes into power. He's fairly old, and he works to restore order and to get things under control again, and that is a good thing. And he's really smart. So he says, I'm going to pick my successor right away. I'm not waiting until I'm on my deathbed or waiting for my successor to pick his own self. No. I'm going to pick him in advance. And he does. And he picks Trajan. And Trajan gets himself a star, all right, as did Vespasian. You'll notice Trajan gets a star. Now, Trajan is one of the most successful emperors they ever had. This is an interesting guy here, all right? He's very, very careful. He doesn't just fly off the handle at any moment. He's very careful, very calculating, making sure his plans will work. Slow and steady wins the race. That's the way Trajan tended to work here, all right? And in later times, they look back and say, this guy really knew what he was doing. This is the best emperor we ever had, all right? Some people said that about him. So he's careful. He's very, very involved in affairs of state. He believed that being the Roman emperor was a job, and that means you did the good job. You did the best job you can. You didn't just wander around doing whatever heck you wanted to. You were careful. You were planning. Very careful sort of guy here. And he would get involved in situations around the empire when he felt necessary, settling disputes and basically helping people make things better. This was his goal here. He had a very strong paternal view of the empire. He saw himself as Emperor Big Daddy. He was the dad, and we were all his kids, and he was going to make things good for all of us. That's the way he saw things here with good old Trajan. Now, it's important, of course, if you're going to be anything, emperor or otherwise, it's always a good idea to have a hobby. I've always told you guys to have a hobby. Pick something you enjoy that has nothing to do with your job or school or anything else, a hobby. And what that does is it gives you something to kind of focus on, that you're not stuck doing the same old thing all the time. And it's good for your mental health to have a hobby. Well, Trajan had a hobby too. Here's his hobby. He liked conquering stuff. He was the last great Roman conqueror, and under Trajan, he made the empire bigger than it would ever be again. All right, he conquered all the way up into Europe, up to the Danube River. All right, he managed to invade and even conquered Mesopotamia, all the way down to the Persian Gulf. Trajan conquers down to the Mesopotamia, all right, conquers through Mesopotamia. So this guy was an incredibly successful conqueror. And the story goes that when he got to the southern part of Mesopotamia and he realized he couldn't conquer anymore, he wept. That's a wonderful story. I don't know if it's true, but it's a wonderful story. And you can imagine the guys back in Rome as he's sending letters back saying, okay, I've conquered this place, add it to the list. I've conquered that place, add it to the list. And they're looking at him back going, where the heck is this anyway? Where is this guy? He was very, very successful conqueror, and he punched the Parthians in the nose, and the empire got bigger than it had ever been before. So yay, hooray, hurrah. But of course, even though they wished he'd lasted forever, Trajan eventually dies. And his successor is a guy named Hadrian. And I've given Hadrian a star as well. And he's a very, very interesting guy. Hadrian is. If you look at a picture of Hadrian, one of the things you notice is he has a beard. Early Roman emperors didn't have beards. Hadrian has a beard. I've always found that interesting because it seems to mark a Greek impact. The Greeks liked beards, and so to the Greeks, having a beard was a nice thing. And so Hadrian has a beard. And this tells us, well, I think it tells us something. He is a cousin of Trajan, and he becomes the emperor when Trajan dies. Now, how does he become an emperor when Trajan dies? Well, here's what he said. He said, here's Trajan, he's dying, and we asked him, who's the next emperor? All right? And according to me, it's Hadrian, right? Now, how do we know Trajan didn't actually say, which is what some people say on their deathbed, right? Well, Hadrian says, there's a real simple solution to this. I've got an army. Any arguments? Well, nobody wanted to argue, so he becomes the next emperor. And he's a very strange, interesting sort of guy. He's a very good emperor. He's a very talented emperor. But he obviously doesn't like hanging around Rome all that much. He likes to travel around the empire. He likes to see the empire, show himself off to people, and this is what he does. Travels extensively. He refounds Jerusalem, all right, which had been abandoned since the disastrous time of 70 AD and the destruction that happened there. But he made it a Roman colony. It's not a Jewish city anymore. All right. This, of course, didn't sit well with the Jews. They had another uprising. He had to put that down, and there was a lot of bloodshed there. Hadrian's also remembered as a builder. Now remember, building big projects is a good way to employ people. So this is a clever idea here. And he also had one other thing which is important, which I think, again, relates to that beard. He patronized Greek culture. He really liked Greek culture. Now, Greek culture is really cool, so it's totally understandable why he would like Greek culture, all right? And so he helped integrate the Greek provinces more completely into the empire by doing this. And so this is an interesting kind of thing, all right? He also realized something else. You know, Trajan, you're a smart guy, but this conquering everything in sight pushed us too far. It's overextended, and he realized we can't hold Mesopotamia. It's too big. And also Mesopotamia is too different. The cultures in Mesopotamia are not enough like Rome for us to be able to really control them. And so he said, okay, we're going to have to evacuate. And he pulled out of Mesopotamia. The Parthians, of course, immediately rushed back in and took control again. All right, but he wisely pulled out of Mesopotamia here. He focused, as the Romans would pretty much do from this point onward, on defending the empire. You have fixed fortifications now, walls to keep barbarians and Parthians and people like that out, rather than trying to go out and conquer them, because it's obviously not something that's going to work very well. All right, so this brings us to the end of Hadrian here, and that gets to about 138 AD. And I'd like to spend a few moments now talking about how the empire actually ran and how it was run and how it was administered here. So how do you administer this? The first thing to keep in mind is this. Old Mao Zedong, the old premier of China, had a very famous and slightly cynical quote, but I'm going to give it to you. And he said, Mao said, ultimately, he said, power comes out the barrel of a gun. In other words, power comes from the ability to project force. Right? And Mao was not entirely wrong about that. He was not entirely right either, because if you just use force to have power, think what North Korea does, you become unstable for that reason. And just using power, the Assyrians, remember, had tried this, when you just use power, direct physical power to get what you want, it will come back to haunt you. But at the same time, if you have no power of that kind, you can't hold things together. So old Mao said, ultimately power comes out the barrel of a gun. In this case, the Romans at the end of a spear. All right? And so this means that Rome's power, Rome's ability to do anything, is based ultimately on its military force, its ability to project power. Now, this is an interesting thing because, of course, the great expansion of Rome had not happened during the Roman Empire, but during the Roman Republic. And this, of course, was a very interesting problem because Roman culture favored conquerors. It favored people who could conquer territory. It did not favor people who could administer territory. And this is a really important point. It doesn't matter how much you conquer. Look at how much Alexander the Great conquered. His empire collapsed immediately. Why? Because it was not administered. Look at Cyrus of Persia, Darius of Persia. They figured out how to administer their empire. It lasted for centuries. So this is an important point for us to keep in mind here. All right? It's not enough to just conquer, and it's not enough to just put an army there and control it the way the Romans are very good at doing. You've got to administer it. Now, once the Roman Empire stops its expansion, that means ambitious people, ambitious guys, are not going to be able to satisfy their ambition by conquering stuff. It ain't going to happen. So instead, they can start shifting their attention and resources to administering the empire better, and this is what they begin to do here. This is what they begin to do. They don't always do it well. The Romans were not always really good at doing this, but they were learning. So how does this all work? Well, the administration of the empire, in one sense, was extremely brutal. If you rebel against Rome, you get your face kicked in. The Jews rebelled 3 times. They rebelled 3 times, massive rebellions. The Jews were really good at fighting. You didn't want to mess with these guys, and each time the Romans crushed them brutally. All right? They destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, as we will see. All right? They crushed them 3 times, and after the 3rd time they said, enough. And they began to kick the Jews out of their own country. They scattered them all over. And this led, of course, to the scattering of Jews ultimately all over the world. All right? And that scattering would last until the 20th century and the founding of the State of Israel. So this is a major impact of the Romans. But they were doing it because the Jews were so good at rebelling. They were so good at giving the Romans trouble. And so that's something that you see as well here. So they could be incredibly brutal. But it's also true that the day-to-day administration of the empire was not as brutal as this. It wasn't necessarily always nice, but it was not as brutal. Punishment was regulated by law, all right? And the fact is, if you wanted to execute somebody in the Roman Empire, you weren't allowed to do it unless you had direct permission from the Romans. And this is an important point. Okay? Because we're going to see down the road when this fellow Jesus, some of you may have heard of him, when Jesus is executed, it's by the Romans. All right? It's by the Romans. And that's because only the Romans were allowed to execute people. Capital punishment they reserved for themselves. The purpose of capital punishment in the Roman Empire was to make a point. It tended to be extremely public. None of this quiet in the background capital punishment. No. Crucifixion, all right, for example, was very popular with the Romans because it was very nasty, a horrible way to die, and it was extremely public to send a message, don't screw with us. All right, so don't screw with us. And this is something we see in this context here. There are other ways to do it as well. You take convicted criminals and you throw them into the gladiatorial arena and you let lions and tigers and bears, oh my, tear them apart. Public execution was a big thing for the Romans. None of this quiet background stuff, public executions here. And it is certainly true the Romans could be unbelievably brutal, and they held order together, when they held the empire together through order. At the same time, the Romans sometimes said, hey, we're going too far, you got to stop. They sometimes would pull back and say, this is not okay. For example, if a slave murdered their master, which is, in my mind, kind of an understandable thing, but anyway, if a slave murdered the master, the Roman rule was to kill the entire household full of slaves, even the ones that had nothing to do with it. In one case, when this was going to happen, a bunch of Romans got together and started protesting. And they got protesting in a serious way till they had to call in the troops and break up the protest. So the Romans sometimes would say, no, you can't go that far. We're going too far. You have to stop here. Now, what's important to keep in mind about this is when we look at the treatment of early Christians, we have to think about this context. The Romans were incredibly brutal, as we'll see, to the early Christians. They were not being specially cruel to them. They were treating them like treated anybody else that they thought was going to give them trouble. And that was an important point to keep in mind. All right, the context of the early Christian persecutions was a typical context in the Roman world. This is the way the Romans typically treated anyone they saw who might give them trouble. And that's an important point to keep in mind. Next time, we'll pick up with our next part and talk a little bit about how the empire would be administered and so forth, and I will pick up the story then.